Welcome, students, to the first video lecture for Healthcare Ethics for Spring 2020. Now we are in distant learning mode, so I wanted to go over the course plan for going forward before I get into the lecture. I've sent this out to you guys by email, but I want to make sure that everyone has it, so I'm going to reiterate it here. We will not be having synchronous class meetings for this course. So that means that there is no Blackboard Connect, no WebEx. We are not going to be doing any of the things where we try to have a conversation online, because there's a lot of inherent difficulties in that. What we're going to be doing instead is I'm going to be recording these video lectures and posting them every week. You're going to watch the lectures, and you're also going to do readings, as you've been doing all along. And your interactive component for this course will be worksheets. So you're going to complete a worksheet that I post along with the readings and the video lectures for each week, and the worksheets will be due on Friday. So this first week's worksheet will be due on Friday, April 10th. Okay, so you will find all of these materials that you will need for the course going forward in the course materials folder on Blackboard. If you have any trouble finding these materials, please email me. The same goes for any questions about the structure of the course or the content of these lectures. Okay, so this lecture and the worksheet that accompanies it are going to focus on one article that you guys have read for this week and a film that we watched together. So we're going to be talking about Antonella Sorbone's article, Telling the Truth to Patients with Cancer, What is the Truth?, which was published in Lancet Oncology in 2006, and Lulu Wang's 2019 film, The Farewell, which provides a narrative example of the ethical dilemma of telling the truth to patients with cancer. So I'm going to start by talking about Sorbone's article, and then I'm going to talk about the film. To begin with, we're going to go over some terms. So Surbone uses a lot of terms that we've heard before in this course, and these are key terms for biomedical ethics and key terms for her in the article and for us in this course. So she talks about informed consent, beneficence, paternalism, and autonomy. So these are all terms you guys have seen before, but as they show up in this article, they have something of a different twist. So when she talks about informed consent, she talks about truth-telling as a necessary component of informed consent. That seems fairly obvious when you think about it on the surface of things, but actually it's a little bit different than what we've been talking about thus far. So we've been talking about informed consent as an exchange of information. So the healthcare provider has a responsibility to provide the patient with facts, information, pieces of data and statistics about their healthcare situation, and to ensure that the patient understands those. When you think about those pieces of information instead as truth, then it becomes a little more complicated. It's a lot easier to think about about information as an abstract quantity than it is to think about truth as a moral duty or a concept that is constructed in relationships. And that's what Surbone wants to draw our attention towards. So another term she uses that is a key term for this course is beneficence. And in her article, we see beneficence come into conflict with autonomy. So in this course already, we've seen beneficence come into conflict with non-maleficence. So, you guys have heard, we've talked about this idea that you might need to do someone a little bit of harm in order to do them good. So you might need to inflict the harm of a shot in order to ensure someone the good of a vaccination. In this case, you might want to do someone good, do the thing that is beneficent, and end up harming their autonomy. Because what we're talking about is how autonomy is constituted in relationship to truth. I think that will become clearer as we move along. So, but she also talks about paternalism. Paternalism is a term that we've discussed in this course primarily with negative connotations. So, paternalism is the idea of father knows best, right? That's that pater, father in Latin, that's hidden in the word. And it's the idea in medicine that the healthcare provider knows what is best for the patient, over and above what the patient thinks is best. But here in Surbone's essay, paternalism might perhaps be redeemed. And this sort of brings us back to the question of beneficence. So I'm going to read a bit from the essay now. And if you guys want to open up your text and follow along, that would be a really good idea. So I'll give you a sec. Get out your text. Okay, and so turn to page 946. And I'm going to read for you where she's talking about paternalism. So she says, paternalistic interpretations of beneficence have been invoked to justify non-disclosure. So what does she mean when she says that? So non-disclosure means not telling the truth. So there are situations in which it might be justified to not tell the truth to a patient, or that is to not tell the full truth or not disclose pertinent pieces of information under the guise of a paternalistic interpretation of beneficence. That is, an idea that what is best for the patient, beneficent, what the provider can do to do the best for their patient, involves the provider retaining knowledge and not sharing it. Okay? She's not so happy about this classic justification for non-disclosure that she draws from biomedical ethics, but she does air it for us as one possible justification for non-disclosure. But she gives us the flip side, 2 reasons in favor of disclosure. So I'm going to go back to page 946. This is the continuation of the same quote. So paternalistic interpretations of beneficence have been invoked to justify non-disclosure, whereas the intrinsic good of truth-telling, both as a moral duty and in recognition of the benefits for patients' autonomy, has been used to validate disclosure. So that means that the intrinsic good of truth-telling is understood here as an abstract principle, something that is always good no matter what in every situation, right? As an abstract ethical principle, it is a moral duty. So it is incumbent upon us, we must do it. It is a moral duty. And on a sort of more specific healthcare ethics angle, it relates to the patient's autonomy. So the patient, their autonomy is benefited, it is good for them, if they receive disclosure. If in order to exercise full autonomy, in her logic here, and in the sort of general logic surrounding truth-telling, in order for a patient to exercise their autonomy, they need the truth. right? So that brings us back to the idea of informed consent as a form of truth-telling. In order to make a medical decision with proper informed consent, that is, in a way that is acting fully autonomously, a patient needs to be told the truth. Okay. And so, guys, to make it specific, the occasion of telling the truth, what the truth that is being told here, both in the article and in the film, is the diagnosis of cancer, right? So this is actually a particularly difficult truth, and that's one of the things that occupies Surbone in her article. It's not very easy to tell someone they have cancer. That said, we're going to do one more term that we've already heard in this course a whole lot, and you've heard it a million times already in this lecture, and that's autonomy. So autonomy looks a whole lot more complicated in this article than it's looked to us before, if it's not complicated enough already. So on page 945, so if you turn back a page, Surbone writes, "In countries centered on family and community values, the word autonomy was typically perceived as being synonymous with isolation rather than freedom." So let me read that for you guys again. In countries centered on family and community values, the word autonomy was typically perceived as being synonymous with isolation rather than freedom. So Surbone moves on fairly quickly from this point in her article, but I think it's actually a really useful and resonant one for us to think about right now, where we're all experiencing some isolation and some doubt in the value of our individual autonomy, perhaps. It's worthwhile to think about whether or not our ability as individuals to act as individuals and to make our own choices and our own decisions about everything is also just another form of being isolated. So that's something that she's suggesting we might see in other cultures besides our own, right? So one of the new terms that she suggests we think about in this article, it's a key term for her, and it's one that we're going to need to think about going forward, that we haven't addressed very much already. This term is cultural competence. So when she raises that idea that autonomy might be like isolation, she's not suggesting, like I am, that we need to maybe think about it in our own context, but that it's something that other people think over there, right? In countries centered on family and community values, implicitly, that is not the United States. We might actually question that, but nonetheless, in the context of her argument, she is talking about countries that are not the United States as being countries that are centered on family and community values, where autonomy has a different meaning and a different value associated with it. So cultural competence in that context would allow us to recognize the difference between two cultural systems for understanding autonomy and to value them both, to not say one is better than the other. So we can think of cultural competence as the ability to understand and respect cultural differences. So to not expect everyone to be the same, which is super important for medical care and for behaving ethically as a medical provider. So another key term, perhaps the biggest term for this article, and it's a new term for us, is truth. And associated with that is truth-telling. Both of these terms are on your worksheet, and they're on there separately, so I want you guys to think a little bit about how truth might be different from the process of truth-telling. For Surbone, the truth of an illness is not reducible to a set of biomedical facts. Okay? So something that is akin to what we've been talking about in terms of information and informed consent looks like it's not quite enough. So she wants us to think instead about truth as something that is dynamic and provisional. So she writes at the end of the essay on page 949, and this is sort of one of the key terms, points in her argument. She writes about the dynamic and provisional nature of truth and the relational nature of patient autonomy. So those two terms are linked, but for the sake of truth, she wants us to think about how truth changes over time, about how it emerges in relationships, in conversations, and about how it's not an easy thing to pin down. That what we think is the truth now we might realize later is not the truth at all. Okay? She also suggests that truth is made of multiple things besides the truth of a diagnosis, in this case, is made of multiple things besides the bare facts of the diagnosis. So truth is not just a positive test result, in this case, but a set of emotional responses, a set of cultural concerns, and even a set of metaphorical resonances. So the truth of having cancer is a lot different from simply a positive test result, right? And when you are communicating to someone that they have cancer, you have to think about all of those big picture things in order to tell them the truth in a way that works for them, right? So there's a whole lot of things that could make up the truth. And in this case, we want to think about truth as something that is specific to a particular situation, right? So I'm not trying to say alternative facts, which is something that's come up a lot in our political discourse, but to say that truth is really, really, really big and really, really difficult. And there are lots of difficult truths, and they make the telling of them very difficult. So that's what this film that we're gonna be talking about dramatizes also. The sort of the ethical difficulty of telling the truth in a situation of cancer diagnosis. So let me return to Surbone's article for a minute here, and I'm going to read to you again the big points of her argument that show up on page 949. So she talks about the dynamic and provisional nature of truth, and she also talks about the relational nature of patient autonomy. So I think we've talked about this a bit already, but what does she mean by relational there? What are the relations in question? So the biggest one for us and for her is the patient-provider relationship. So she characterizes this as a relationship of asymmetry and vulnerability. So on page 944, she writes, "The patient-provider relationship is a dynamic, asymmetrical relation of help involving individuals with unequal knowledge and power." So dynamic, again, means that it is changing, and asymmetrical refers to that idea of unequal knowledge and power. So one person in this case holds a lot more knowledge and power and position than the other, right? And there's a danger here of treating those two persons as equals. So she talks in the beginning about the idea of autonomy is being something that we derive from contract law. She doesn't specifically say this, but it's embedded in her argument. And that there's a danger of treating the two players in an autonomous relation as true equals. So we can think about this in terms of economic transactions. So we consider people, when you are purchasing an item at the store, we consider you and the person who is selling it to you to be equals, in the sense that you are just doing, for this one transaction, all you are doing is exchanging a currency and receiving a good, right? And in that case, you are simply equal abstract agents, and you have equal power. One of you has the good, one of you has the money, and you exchange them, and that's it, right? But in the patient-provider relationship, it's not so equal. So one of you, in this case, has knowledge and truth about the patient's diagnosis, and one of you has nothing. One of you is waiting for the provider to give you all of that knowledge and truth and information and context and care. So she suggests that it is inaccurate to think about autonomy in that sort of abstract way, and to reduce the patient-provider relationship to a relationship of autonomous individuals. So let me read you her quote again. On page 944, she refers to the patient-provider relationship as a dynamic, asymmetrical relation of help involving individuals with unequal knowledge and power. So thinking about that help there and the inequality, we can think back to the idea of a fiduciary relationship, which we've talked about earlier in this class, which is the idea that the patient puts trust in their provider because the provider has a set of knowledge and skills, and the patient trusts their provider, and thereby the provider acquires a fiduciary obligation to act on behalf of the patient in their best interest, right? So that's that relationship of help that she's talking about, and one that is based in inequality. Okay, so the relational nature of patient autonomy then is embedded in this fundamentally unequal relationship, but it's also embedded in the relationship between the patient and their family, or the relationship between the patient and society, right? So this is getting back to the idea of autonomy in relation to isolation, and the truth that none of us exist in a truly isolated system. So we have been emphasizing the value of individual patient autonomy a lot in this course. But autonomy can also be conceived of as a burden. Making healthcare decisions is difficult. And it is a burden, the burden of making those decisions is not a burden that everyone wants to bear. So we often think of this in the sense that no one should be making healthcare decisions alone. So we don't actually expect people to act as fully autonomous abstract individuals. And so on 946 in your article, Surbone refers to this as a new way of sort of rethinking autonomy, and suggesting that some patients wish to exercise their autonomy to delegate, temporarily or permanently, the information and decision-making process to their oncologists and loved ones. So some patients wish to delegate their autonomy to their oncologists or to their loved ones, right? So the idea, this is getting back to that idea of shared decision-making we've been talking about a fair bit in this course. That the idea is that if you are thinking about making autonomous decisions as a burden, you might think about autonomy as the autonomy to delegate, the autonomy to say, no, I want you to make the decision for me, right? So that is a right that the patient also has, not just to make their own decisions, but to ask others to make them for them. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys some problems, or really one problem that I see with this article, and then I'm going to move on to talking about the film. Okay, so despite multiple attempts to draw our attention to cultural differences in regard to truth-telling in medical practice, the article in many ways takes for granted the idea that Western norms, which Surbone refers to as, quote, norms for the developed world, end quote. The article takes for granted that these norms are the best. So that is to say, the article takes for granted the idea that telling the truth is always and in every situation, telling the abstract truth or the whole truth or the truth as best as you can get it is always the best plan. That there is no situation in which it is a good idea to withhold truth in the situation of diagnosing a patient with cancer. This is what is enshrined in American law, and it's what's enshrined in the classical principle of autonomy. But because she is putting such emphasis on the idea of respecting cultural differences, I think we might expect her to respect those differences a bit more in her article. What I want to draw your attention to is a sort of tick of the language that she uses, and that tick reveals her connection to a sort of long tradition of philosophical thought that suggests that the norms of the Western world are always the best norms. So Surbone is working with a very old, very deeply ingrained idea of progress in her article. And this is an idea that is dominant in American medical, political, and legal thought. So it is the dominant idea in the culture that we live and work in. The terms that she uses are very widespread. So you've heard them before. The distinction she draws is between developed and developing countries, right? Norms for the developed world. So this is another way of saying first world and third world, or as some people say now, the global north and the global south. And it's a way of dividing up the world that goes all the way back to the project of European colonialism, which took place in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, so for a long swath of time. And it's something that sort of still lingers in our understanding of the world. So the idea that she's working with here is an idea that some people have progressed in time, that some people are more modern, they're living in the future. We are, in her article, we are these people. We are living in the future. We are in the 21st century. We're in the brand new world. And other people are still developing. So we've developed. We're like, teenagers who have fully developed. And other people are still developing. They're like slow children left behind. And they're living in the past, right? But come on, everyone is actually living in the present. All of the time. All of the people all over the world who are alive right now, who are all experiencing the coronavirus epidemic, are all living in the same present. Okay? So bear that in mind going forward, that this distinction that we use so easily between developing and developed nations has a really deep history of inequality embedded in it that privileges the norms of colonizing powers and European and American society. Okay, so I'm going to give you another example from her text so we can think a bit more about her language and how it connects to the idea of autonomy that shows up in Lulu Wang's film. So on page 945, she writes, "In the past few years, in most developing countries, people with cancer have been kept in the dark, not given the opportunity to ask questions and find answers, and have been deprived of the chance to put their affairs in order or say goodbye to their loved ones." So look at the language she uses here. People have been kept in the dark. So this is the idea of darkness associated with obscurity and lack of knowledge, and the dark continent of Africa is a like really common phrase in colonial discourse, and it's the idea that against the principles of the Enlightenment in the West, certain people are shrouded in darkness as entire peoples, which is kind of mad, right? And so here, that is referring to patients who haven't been told the truth of their diagnosis or told the truth in a way that is consistent with the norms of HIPAA and Western medicine and the society that we live in now. So in the past few years, in most developing countries, people with cancer have been kept in the dark, not given the opportunity to ask questions and find answers, have been deprived. Think of that language of deprivation. Poor, hungry children in the subaltern world are deprived of the opportunity of education. Here, cancer patients are deprived of the chance to put their affairs in order or to say goodbye to their loved ones. And so, leaving aside the question of whether or not China can appropriately be called a developing country in this framework that Surbone articulates, we might think about how the movie problematizes this idea of withholding a diagnosis. That such withholding keeps patients in the dark and deprives them of their chance to put their affairs in order or to say goodbye to their loved ones. And those two specific examples that show up in Surbone's text, the idea of the patient putting their affairs in order and saying goodbye to their loved ones, are explicitly discussed in this film. So keep your eye out for them when you're watching. So I'm going to give you guys some important scenes from the film to keep an eye out for when you are watching, and also to refer to in your worksheet. So the first important scene is just, I want you guys to pay attention because it's easy to miss. So in the very, very beginning of the film, we see the grandmother, one of the two main characters, the grandmother, in a hospital setting. We see her getting a scan, and we see her in a waiting room. And then we see her sister talking with the doctor. She asks, "Where's my sister?" And then the camera cuts to a shot of her sister talking with a doctor behind a pane of glass. So we don't hear what they're saying. We just see them talking. And then we see the sister explain to the grandmother that everything is fine. But we learn a bit later that everything is maybe not fine. So when you think back to that to that moment in the beginning of the film, that scene is the scene of diagnosis. So that's when the sister, instead of the patient, the grandmother, is told the diagnosis of cancer. Okay, so that's the particular scene that Surbone is talking about. And here it's been displaced. So already we're in a system where things look a little bit different from what Surbone is focusing on. Okay, so you guys also have a look at the scene about 11 minutes in that will help sort of clarify that initial moment of diagnosis. This is the scene where Billy, the main character, learns that her grandmother is dying of cancer. And we learn of the family's decision not to tell her. So we get a rationale here for the family's decision from Billy's mother. She says, it's not the cancer that kills them, it's the fear. And we might think about beneficence here, the idea that ignorance is bliss, right? That it is better for the patient not to know. That is what the family decides. We also learn an important plot point, that Billy's cousin is getting married, but that this marriage is just a sham. Her father says the wedding is an excuse, so everyone can go see her. So the wedding is not a sort of separate occasion. The wedding is the excuse so that everyone can go see the grandmother and say goodbye before she passes. But Billy's parents have not invited her to come because Billy's mother is worried that she cannot hide her emotions, that Billy is too emotional and she'll give the secret away. But she decides to come anyway. So the next shot we see is of her on an airplane, basically. There's a bit more in New York. But the next scene I want you guys to focus on occurs approximately 46 minutes in, and it's another scene in a hospital. So the grandmother goes into the hospital and the family freaks out and everyone rushes to the hospital because they're like, oh my God, she's dying, she's dying, she's dying. And it turns out that she's not. She's just there because she thinks that she has a cough and she needs a new cough medication or something of the sort. But in this scene, Billy has a conversation in English with the doctor who studied in England about the decision not to tell the grandmother. And so you get a bit of his perspective as a doctor on why it might be better not to disclose a diagnosis of cancer. And he refers to it, so she asks him, Billy asks Dr. Song, as he's called, isn't it a lie? And he says, it's a good lie. So we might think about the ethical implications of a good lie here, right? We tell white lies, little lies all the time. But there are some situations in which we think we have a moral obligation to tell the truth. We think it is truly unethical to lie. So is this one of those situations? Are there other ways to negotiate this? So think about what is the truth and what is a lie here in terms of Surbone's version and in terms of this film's. And then after you pay attention to that speech, make sure you keep focused for a little bit longer and pay attention to the scene where the family is in the waiting room after this conversation. So shortly following that scene at 46 minutes in, you see the family grappling with the ethical implications of their decision not to disclose the grandmother's illness. So here is when they ask those questions about putting her affairs in order, and also the question of legality comes up. So Billy says this would be illegal in America. Okay, so this is a question of cultural competencies, but also about how ethics are enshrined in law. And another important fact that we learn in this conversation is that the grandmother did this same thing in the past. So the grandmother withheld the truth from the grandfather in the same way when he was dying of cancer. So what are the ethical implications of withholding a diagnosis in that situation, right? Where you know that the person has withheld the set of information prior in the same situation. So you are acting as their agent here, right? We talked about healthcare agents and people who are surrogate decision makers. The sister is acting as a surrogate decision maker here, and she is making the decision that the grandmother would have made, she thinks, because it is a decision the grandmother did make in the past. So leaving aside the question of whether or not we think she has the authority to act as a surrogate decision maker here, she says she justifies her decision, her behavior as a surrogate, based upon the principles of making a decision according to the patient's wishes, as the patient would have wanted. Okay, so another important scene for you guys to focus on, we've only got 2 more, don't worry. Another important scene for you guys to focus on occurs at approximately 1 hour in, and it's sort of a dramatic set point in the film. It's this big speech, the East versus West speech, that's given by Billy's uncle. So he says, in the East, a person's life is part of a whole, family, society. So think about that second form of relational autonomy here. He says, it's our duty to carry her emotional burden for her. So it's the duty of the family to carry the emotional burden of the diagnosis of cancer for the grandmother. How might that relate to the idea of autonomy as a burden in the context of Surbone's article? So pay attention to that speech, maybe watch it twice, move the cursor back, and also pay attention to the wedding speeches at the end. So compare the speeches that are given by Billy and her uncle Haven. So Haven, having just made this grand speech about it being the duty of the family to carry the emotional burden of the diagnosis for the grandmother, gives away his feelings in the speech on stage. He starts crying really dramatically, and everyone turns and is silent and looks at him, right? So has he changed his mind? Is he unwilling to carry the emotional burden? Billy, on the other hand, her mother was so worried that her emotions would give her away that she, in the very beginning, if you think back to the beginning of the film, Billy's mother was worried that she would give away the whole secret to the grandmother. Yet when she gives her speech, she's not nearly as emotional. She holds it in. She just gives a sort of ordinary speech, ordinary congratulations speech at a wedding, right? So has Billy changed her mind here? Is she carrying the emotional burden of her grandmother's diagnosis? And what I want you guys to think about, and I think perhaps the payoff of this film, watching this film in relationship to this article, in addition to problematizing our ideas of autonomy and cultural competency, there's a bigger question at stake here about the relationship between emotions and truth. So think about that as you're watching. How do emotions inflect truth? How do emotions maybe change information into something that we think of in a bigger, more abstract way as truth? And how do emotions play out in this film in ways that might help us think about how emotions play out in the situations of diagnosis that we might encounter in our own professional lives? Okay? So I'm going to end it there. If you guys have questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to email me, and I will look forward to hearing back from you via your worksheets. Okay, so take care and be safe.